Jesse Woodson James was an American outlaw, bank and train robber, guerrilla, and leader of the James Younger Gang. Raised in the Little Dixie area of western Missouri, James and his family maintained strong Southern sympathies. He and his brother Frank James joined pro-Confederate guerrillas known as bushwhackers operating in Missouri and Kansas during the American Civil War. As followers of William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, they were accused of committing atrocities against Union soldiers and civilian abolitionists, including the Centralia Massacre in 1864. After the war, as members of various gangs of outlaws, Jesse and Frank robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains across the Midwest, gaining national fame and often popular sympathy despite the brutality of their crimes. The James brothers were most active as members of their own gang from about 1866 until 1876, when as a result of their attempted robbery of a bank in Northfield, Minnesota, several members of the gang were captured or killed. They continued in crime for several years afterward, recruiting new members, but came under increasing pressure from law enforcement seeking to bring them to justice. On the 3rd of April, 1882, Jesse James was shot and killed by Robert Ford, a new recruit to the gang who hoped to collect a reward on Jame's head and a promised amnesty for his previous crime. Jesse Woodson James was born on the 5th of September, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri, near the site of present-day Kearney. This area of Missouri was largely settled by people from the Upper South, especially Kentucky and Tennessee, and became known as Little Dixie for this reason. James had two full siblings, his elder brother, Alexander Franklin Frank James, and a younger sister, Susan Lavinia James. He was of English and Welsh descent. His father, Robert S. James, farmed commercial hemp in Kentucky and was Baptist minister before coming to Missouri. After he married, he migrated to Bradford, Missouri and helped found William Joel College in Liberty, Missouri. He held 6 slaves and more than 100 acres of farmland. Robert traveled to California during the gold rush to minister to those searching for gold. He died when James was 3 years old. After Robert's death, his widow Zrelda remarried twice, first to Benjamin Sims in 1852 and then in 1855 to Dr. Reuben Samuel, who moved into the James family house. Jesse's mother and Samuel had 4 children together, Sarah Louisa, John Thomas, Fanny Quantrill, and Archie Peyton Samuel. Zrelda and Samuel acquired a total of 7 slaves, who served mainly as farmhands in tobacco cultivation. The approach of the American Civil War loomed large in the James Samuel household. Missouri was a border state, sharing characteristics of both North and South, but 75% of the population was from the South or other border states. Clay County in particular was strongly influenced by the Southern culture of its rural pioneer families. Farmers raised the same crops and livestock as in the areas from which they had migrated. They brought slaves with them and purchased more according to their needs. The county counted more slaveholders and more slaves with them and purchased more according to their needs. The county counted more slaveholders and more slaves than most other regions of the state. In Missouri as a while, slaves accounted for only 10% of the population, but in Clay County they constituted 25%. Aside from slavery, the culture of Little Dixie was Southern in other ways as well. They influenced how the population acted during and for a period of time after the war. After the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, Clay County became the scene of great turmoil, as the question of whether slavery would be expanded into the neighboring Kansas territory bred tension and hostility. Many people from Missouri migrated to Kansas to try to influence its future. Much of the dramatic build-up to the Civil War centered on the violence that erupted. After a series of campaigns and battles between conventional armies in 1861, guerrilla warfare gripped Missouri, waged between secessionist bushwhackers and Union forces which largely consisted of local militias known as Jayhawkers. A bitter conflict ensued, resulting in an escalating cycle of atrocities committed by both sides. Confederate guerrillas murdered civilian Unionists, executed prisoners, and scalped the dead. The Union presence enforced martial law with raids on homes, arrests of civilians, summary executions, and banishment of Confederate sympathizers from the state. The James Samuel family sided with the Confederate at the outbreak of war. Frank James joined a local company recruited for the secessionist Drew Lobb's army, and fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861. He fell ill and returned home soon afterward. In 1863, he was identified as a member of a guerrilla squad that operated in Clay County. In May of that year, a Union militia company raided the James Samuel farm looking for Frank's group. They tortured Reuben Samuel by briefly hanging him from a tree. According to legend, they lashed young Jesse. Frank James eluded capture and was believed to have joined the guerrilla organized led by William C. Quantrill, known as Quantrill's Raiders. It is thought that he took part in the notorious massacre of some 200 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas, a center of abolitionists. Frank followed Quantrill to Sherman, Texas over the winter of 1863-1864. In the spring he returned in a squad commanded by Fletch Taylor. After they arrived in Clay County, 16-year-old Jesse James joined his brother in Taylor's group. Taylor was severely wounded in the summer of 1864, losing his right arm to a shotgun blast. The James brothers then joined the bushwhacker group led by William Bloody Bill Anderson. Jesse suffered a serious wound to the chest that summer. The Clay County Provost Marshal reported that both Frank and Jesse James took part in the Centralia Massacre in September, in which guerrillas stopped a train carrying unarmed Union soldiers returning home from duty and killed or wounded some 22 of them. The guerrillas scalped and dismembered some of the dead. The guerrillas also ambushed and defeated a pursuing regiment of Major A.V.E. Johnson's Union troops, killing all who tried to surrender, who numbered more than 100. Frank later identified Jesse as a member of the band who had fatally shot Major Johnson. As a result of the James brothers' activity, at the end of the Civil War, Missouri remained deeply divided. The conflict split the population into three bitterly opposed factions: anti-slavery Unionists, identified with the Republican Party; segregationist conservative Unionists, identified with the Democratic Party; and pro-slavery, ex-Confederate, many of whom were also allied with the Democrats, especially in the southern part of the state. The Republican-dominated Reconstruction legislature passed a new state constitution that freed Missouri's slaves. It temporarily excluded former Confederates from voting, serving on juries, becoming corporate officers, or preaching from church pulpits. The atmosphere was volatile, with widespread clashes between individuals and between armed gangs of veterans from both sides of the war. Jesse recovered from his chest wounds at his uncle's boarding house in Harlem, Missouri. He was tended to by his first cousin, Zrelda Z. Mims, names after Jesse's mother. Jesse and his cousin began a 9-year courtship that culminated in their marriage. Meanwhile, his former commander Archie Clement kept his bushwhacker gang together and began to harass Republican authorities. These men were the likely culprits in the first daylight armed bank robbery in the United States during peacetime, the robbery of the Clay County Saving Association in the Liberty. Meanwhile, the James brothers joined the Cole Younger and his brothers John, Jim and Bob, as well as Cole Miller and other former Confederates, to form what came to be known as the James Younger Gang, with Jesse James as the most public face of the gang. The gang carried out a string of robberies from Iowa to Texas, and from Kansas to West Virginia. They robbed banks, stagecoaches and a fair in Kansas City, often carrying out their crimes in front of crowds, and even hammering it up for the bystanders. On the 21st of July, 1873, they turned to train robbery, derailing a Rock Island Line train west of Adair, Iowa, and stealing approximately $3,000. For this, they wore Ku Klux Klan masks. By this time, the Klan had been suppressed in the South by President Grant's use of the Enforcement Acts. Former rebels attacked the railroads as symbols of threatening centralization. The gang's later train robberies had a lighter touch. The gang held up passengers only twice, choosing in all other incidents to take only the contents of the express safe in the baggage car. John Newman Edwards made sure to highlight such techniques when creating an image of James as a kind of Robin Hood. Despite sentiment toward the gang's crimes, there is no evidence that the James gang ever shared any of the robbery money outside their personal. In 1874, the Adams Express Company turned to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to stop the James Younger gang. The Chicago-based agency worked primarily against urban professional criminals, as well as providing industrial security, such as strike breaking. Because the gang received support by many former Confederate soldiers in Missouri, they elude the Pinkertons. Joseph Witcher, an agent dispatched to infiltrate Zrelda Samuel's farm, was soon found killed. Two other agents, Captain Louis J. Lull and John Boyle, were sent after the Youngers. Lull was killed by two of the Youngers in a roadside gunfight on the 17th of March, 1874. Before he died, Lull fatally shot John Younger. A deputy sheriff named Edwin Daniels also died in the skirmish. Allen Pinkerton, the agency's founder and leader, took on the case as a personal vendetta. He began to work with former Unionists who lived near the James family farm. On the night of the 25th of January, 1875, he staged a raid on the homestead. Detectives threw an incendiary device into the house. It exploded, killing James's young half-brother Archie and blowing off one of Zrelda Samuel's arms. Afterward, Pinkerton denied that the raid's intent was arson. But biographer Ted Yateman On the 7th of September 1876, the opening day of hunting season in Minnesota, the James Younger gang attempted a raid on the First National Bank or Northfield, Minnesota. The robbery quickly went wrong, however, and after the robbery, only Frank and Jesse James remained alive and free. Cole and Bob Younger later stated that they selected the bank because they believed it was associated with the Republican politician Adelbert Ames, the governor of Mississippi during Reconstruction, and Union General Benjamin Butler, Ames's father-in-law and the Union commander of occupied New Orleans. Ames was a stockholder in the bank, but Butler had no direct connection to it. The gang attempted to rob the bank in Northfield at about 2 p.m. To carry out the robbery, the gang divided into two groups. 3 men entered the bank, 2 guarded the door outside, and 3 remained near a bridge across an adjacent square. The robbers inside the bank were thwarted when acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood refused to open the safe, falsely claiming that it was secured by a time lock even as they held a Bowie knife to his throat and cracked his skull with a pistol butt. Assistant cashier Alonzo N. Spunker was wounded in the shoulder as he fled through the back door of the bank. Meanwhile, the citizens of Northfield grew suspicious of the men guarding the door and raised the alarm. The 5 With his gang nearly annihilated, James trusted only the Ford brothers, Charlie and Robert. Although Charlie had been out on raids with James, Bob Ford was an eager new recruit. For protection, James asked the Ford brothers to move in with him and his family. James had often stayed with their sister Martha Bolton and, according to rumor, he was smitten with her. By that time, Bob Ford had conducted secret negotiations with Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden, planning to bring in the famous outlaw. Crittenden had made capture of the James brothers his top priority. In his inaugural address he declared that no political motives could be allowed to keep them from justice. Barred by law from offering a large reward, he turned to the railroad and express corporations to put up a $5,000 bounty for the delivery of each of them and an additional $5,000 for the conviction of either of them. On April 3, 1882, after eating breakfast, the Fords and Jameses went into the living room before traveling to Platte City for a robbery. From newspaper, James had just learned that gang member Dick Liddell had confessed to participating in Woodhit's murder. He was suspicious that the Fords had not told him about it. Robert Ford later said he believed that James had realized they were there to betray him. Instead of confronting them, James walked across. Rumors of Jesse James' survival proliferated almost as soon as the newspapers announced his death. Some said that Robert Ford killed someone other than James, in an elaborate plot to allow him to escape justice. These tales have received little credence, then or since. None of James's biographers accepted them as plausible. The body buried in Kearney, Missouri as Jesse James was exhumed in 1995 and subjected to mitochondrial DNA typing. The report, prepared by N.C. Stone, Ph.D., James E. Stars, LLM, and Mark Stoneking, Ph.D., stated the mount DNA recovered from the remains was consistent with the mount DNA of one of James's relatives in the female line. The theme of survival was featured in a 2009 documentary, Jesse James' Hidden Treasure, which aired on the History Channel. The documentary was dismissed as pseudo-history and pseudoscience by historian Nancy Samuelson in a review she wrote for the winter 2009-2010 edition of the James Younger Gang Journal. J. Frank Dalton claimed to be Jesse James. He died the 15th of August 1951, in Granbury, Texas. Dalton was allegedly 101 years old at the time of his first public appearance, in May 1948. Aran Baker, Hood County. James's turn to crime after the end of the Reconstruction era helped cement his place in American life and memory as a simple but remarkably effective bandit. After 1873 he was covered by the national media as part of social banditry. During his lifetime, James celebrated chiefly by former Confederates, to whom he appealed directly in his letters to the press. Displaced by Reconstruction, the antebellum political leadership mythologized the James Gang exploits. Frank Triplett wrote about James as a progressive no-aristocrat with purity of race. Some historians credit James' myth as contributing to the rise of former Confederates to dominance in Missouri politics. In 1880s, both U.S. senators from the state, former Confederate military commander Francis Cockrell and former Confederate Congressman George Graham Vest, were identified with the Confederate cause. In the 1880s, after James' death, the James Gang became the subject of dime novels that represented the bandits as pre-industrial models of resistance. During the populist and progressive eras, James became an icon as America's Robin Hood, standing up against corporations in defense of the small farmer, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. But there is no evidence that he shared the loot of his robberies with anyone other than his gang members. They enjoyed the